I'm going to go ahead and start the webinar. Welcome everybody who has signed in so far, and we'll do another quick welcome here in another minute or two if it looks like we're getting quite a few more participants. So this is the ABOUND Harvest Showcase virtual series. This is our first webinar within the series, and we appreciate everybody jumping on. So back in September 14th to be exact, in Wellington, Colorado, which is just north of Fort Collins, we had a live in-person showcase and had about 75 people out to see the crop in the ground. And this is a picture that you can see in the background here behind the ABOUND Harvest Showcase lettering. That is our actual field that we had everyone out to. And we've got a short video that we'll show you here as soon as I review the agenda that will give you an opportunity to see the field somewhat in person, by video at least. So I'll just walk through the agenda here briefly. You can see a number of pictures of people on the screen. We have Dr. John McKay, who's going to be talking with us about breeding and genetics. John is the Director of Genetics for New West Genetics. So he will be going through a number of slides to kind of take you through some of the things that we do here to make sure that we can bring you the absolute best varieties possible. And then Daniel Willis is going to talk to us about key agronomic factors to be considered. Daniel's an agronomist here at New West, so he's going to be walking through what those key agronomic factors that you need to be thinking about are. After that, Dr. Rich Fletcher is going to be talking about harvest considerations and techniques. He'll also touch a little bit on feminized. Our variety, as most of you know already, is dioecious, which means male and female seeds. And it will pollinate, but Rich will talk a little bit about things to think about with feminized as well as dioecious varieties. And then Del Kreiser is going to be talking to us about successful harvesting techniques from Botanacor. And so he's going to share things that you should be thinking about when you're sampling your crop for testing, how to go about sampling, etc. So we'll jump into those. But before we start, we want to just share a brief video with you from the actual day of our event. And let's see if I can make this slide advance. Should play for us, I hope.
ABOUND seed technology is a game changer for the hemp industry and for row crop farmers. We are proud to have bred our varieties specifically to fit row crop farming. Growers can reap the benefits of a dual crop with better yield of high CBD flower and nutritious grain over our competitors' varieties at significantly lower production costs. These varieties are backed by 7 years of research, development, and breeding. We are launching our showcase in person and virtually to introduce you to our varieties. We invite you to join us to follow the flower from the field all the way to the consumer, and also see firsthand how ABOUND seed goes from our farm to your field.
So that gives you just a little bit of a chance to see the crop in the field. We do have a little bit longer version that's on our website if you want to check that out as well. You should have seen that when you went in to register, and that gives you an opportunity to have a chance to see what the field looks like. With that, Sarah, can you walk us through a couple of the housekeeping items that we have here? Sorry, I surprised you, I bet.
Yeah, sure. So we're going to be taking questions on the Q&A within Zoom. So just if you want to click the Q&A icon in your Zoom window and submit your questions there. And then after each section, we'll get back to the questions and we'll discuss after each presentation. And then we'll have a final question and answer session at the very end.
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah. So we're going to go ahead and jump in then with Dr. John McKay. And John, I can advance these for you as we get going. I think you're on mute at the moment. There we go.
All right. Hello. Good morning or afternoon, I guess, depending on where you are. Nice to be here virtually. As Jenny said, I'm the Director of Genetics for New West Genetics, and wanted to tell you a couple of things today. Next slide, please. So this is my expertise is in genetics and breeding. And so these are the three things I'm going to tell you today. First, you probably know this if you're on this call, but hemp is defined as varieties of cannabis sativa with a THC content of 0.3% or less. The US adopted this definition That's also the same as how it's defined in Canada, the EU, and several other places. The take-home message is that THC content, which is obviously important from this regulatory perspective, is under strong genetic control and can be stabilized by breeding. And then finally, that breeding in general, as well as specifically for THC compliance, adaptation, and increased yield, will help make hemp a more sustainable option for farmers. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are data from evaluating stable certified European varieties here in Colorado, and these data are published. But I'm showing you here the simple pie chart. So if you look at the pie chart on the left, you'll see that the relative influence, so the percent of variation in yield, that's explained by genotype, the environment. In this case, it's a split plot with full and limited irrigation, and then this genotype environment interaction. So as you might guess, for yield, all genotypes had lower yield under limited irrigation than under greater irrigation, but the degree to which they were sensitive to that varied among genotypes. Some genotypes dropped off steeply and some were relatively flat, and that's what's in that's represented here in that gray by this G by E term. Okay, so now if we look at THC, this is actually percent THCA on a per mass basis across these same genotypes. You can see that almost all of the variation in this trait is controlled by genotype. There's a 2% of the variation in THC that was explained by the environment. In general, every genotype under drought conditions made slightly less THC. They might have gone from 0.2 to 0.19. So there's a very small but significant effect. And no evidence for significant G by E. All genotypes had a slightly lower THC content, but it didn't move them hardly at all. So it's not like something's going from compliant to non-compliant or vice versa. So that's the data. We have other data, and Cornell has published data on this as well, that THC content is highly under genetic control. Next slide, please. This is just to discuss the idea of breeding and how it works and why you should all like it. So on the x-axis, this is a histogram, so would be trait values of your favorite trait, and then above that shows the breeding cycle. So we start up at the top there by inducing variation. Typically that's through recombination, but there are other means of that. Once you create all this variation, then you have to have well designed experiments with statistical tests to tell all of the genotypes apart and place them on the appropriate part of this continuous distribution. And then once you do that, and you've done that accurately, then selection is a matter of just picking part of this distribution to move forward. So if this was a yield trait, you would pick the right tail of the distribution of the highest yielding individuals. If this was THC content, you would pick stuff on the left side of the distribution. And for something maybe like maturity or flowering time, you might actually want to pick things from the mean, closer to the mean of the distribution. And this, you just keep repeating this process, and that's how yields have increased over time in every domesticated and bred species. Next slide.
Oh, hang on, there we go.
So this is these are data from corn, as we call it here in the U.S., or maize, and these are data starting from the 1850s. So on the x-axis is the year, and on the y-axis is yield in bushels per acre. And you can see that open pollinated varieties of corn had about 30 bushels per acre for a long time. And then starting in the 1940s, they started developing different hybrid systems for corn, which started to increase yield, almost double yield from 30 to or 25 to 50 bushels per acre. And then the biggest change that caused this slope to increase over time was data-based breeding. This was when serious seed companies started. They hired statisticians, used experimental design, and to create good estimates of breeding values that would then let them accurately pick the best performing varieties or genetics to move forward. This yield slope was kept up through the addition of marker-based selection to add resistance to all the pests that started emerging. And then you can see as we switch to the green dots, GMOs help to stabilize yield and maintain the same gain that was initially achieved through database breeding. So those are the three things I wanted to tell you today, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Sarah, any questions that have come in yet?
Yeah, we do have one question for John. Do the females produce seeds when they get pollinated? And that leads on to, doesn't that reduce the amount of flower you can harvest? I've always thought that no males in the field was better.
So yes, females, this is their job is to reproduce when they get pollinated. So if you have a population that's male and females, the females will produce seed. That doesn't necessarily reduce the amount of flower. It certainly changes the ratio of flower to seed from when you have none. But what we see is you can produce very similar yields of flower with and without pollination. And in fact, if you have a high population density or maximizing yield per acre, you can get maximum flower yields. And then the challenge, which is not incredibly challenging, but it is a challenge, is to separate the flower from the seed if it's going into an extraction pipeline. And I think Rich will talk about that later. There's also a question about the reference for the Cornell paper. So I can post that Stack et al. Paper as well as the one I referenced into this Q&A chat later. John Mizikio asks about why there's a large segment for error in the pie chart. If you can go back to that slide.
Yep.
Good to see you're paying attention, John. The error, so this is a two-way ANOVA, right? This experimental design and the statistical analysis is a two-way ANOVA. There's two factors, genotype and environment, and then there's an interaction term, G by E. Those are the three things that are manipulated in the experiment. Any variation that's not attributed to those three terms, genotype, environment, or G by E, goes into the error term. So this is a statistical error term, meaning that we can't explain it based on the factors here. For example, for yield, that error is noise that within plots or between plots, and on the THC side, that is likely due to losing some cannabinoids through the process of threshing. And so if some plots were handled, this was an experiment that was done at Colorado State University, and some of the plots were threshed differently than others or harvested at different times. And so that would create some variation in cannabinoid content that's not due to the environmental treatment or the genotype.
Great. Thanks,
Um,
John.
Sure. All right. Austin Jones asked, what are the prospects for moving to hybrid seed production in hemp? I don't know how to say what are the prospects, but we are working on a pipeline for hybrid seed production. There are, hybrid seed, for those of you who don't know, involves crossing two or more inbred stable lines together. Most corn varieties that are sold now involve a single cross between two inbred lines. In the early days, they did double crosses. However, if you just take two inbred lines and cross them, it's unlikely that they're going to be better. That the hybrid is going to be better than either of the two inbreds. So most of the time, when you just cross two inbreds, they're not better. What you have to do is figure out what particular hybrids combine well together. That's an empirical process that takes years to start to figure out, and we've been working on that. I don't know. Judy Daniels asked, what are the measured environmental parameters? I don't understand the question. If you're talking about this pie chart, we manipulated the factor irrigation as a way to induce environmental variation. There was a lot of people we were talking to were getting their information off of the internet and thinking that drought stress plants actually produce more THC. We showed that that has an almost negligible effect, but they actually produce slightly less THC. What are we breeding for? We'll get into that with we're breeding for harvest index and yield per acre of flower, stalk, and grain. And that's not necessarily all in the same variety. And I think both Rich and Daniel will get into some details on that.
Yeah, and there is mention to low THC. So we are focusing on hemp only today. So THC compliance has been the #1 selection criteria thus far.
Great. Okay, excellent question. Seems like we got a lot of questions out there. I would suggest, why don't we move on to Daniel's presentation and then see what questions we have at that point. We will also come back at the end. We'll have questions after each person's presentation, but we'll come back at the end as well. So the way we've done Daniel's is a little bit different from John's. He pre-recorded his presentation inside PowerPoint. So you're going to see his slides with his picture at the bottom and pre-recorded. As soon as that's over, it's about 7 minutes. Then we will turn it back on and you can still chat your questions, but Daniel will be able to answer your questions live. So we'll go ahead and start that up.
ABOUND is a game-changing technology that's been bred specifically for row crop farmers. I don't know how much you all know about hemp. I'm sure it varies some, but it's a dioecious species, meaning that male and female flowers are usually on separate plants. And this, coupled with the fact that hemp can be grown for multiple purposes, fiber, grain, or more recently, cannabinoids, has led to some interesting production styles. The primary production style for cannabinoids now is a low-density feminized approach, where the goal is to have all females in the field. This is because the cannabinoids are primarily located on the trichomes of the female floral parts. This low-density feminized approach uses either feminized seed or sometimes clonal transplants planted at low density in the field because they're expensive and they want to maximize the yield per plant. But this leaves a lot of bare ground that results in weed control challenges and expenses. And then it also requires fairly continual roguing because feminization isn't perfect to prevent males from pollinating those females. And despite your best efforts, it's very possible that you'll miss one, or your neighbor may have hemp pollen, or even feral weedy hemp populations out there could have hemp pollen blow in because it's very small and travels a long distance and pollinate your crop. So this is kind of the justification for what ABOUND is. ABOUND uses traditional agronomic row crop principles that utilize high density. So instead of a couple thousand plants per acre, we generally recommend 125,000 to 250,000 plants per acre. And our varieties are dioecious, meaning that there's male and female plants. So you end up with enhanced CBD flower on the females as well as grain from the same crop. We're able to plant, control weeds and harvest utilizing existing equipment. So we really think this makes it more sustainable, scalable, and dependable for farmers. So for field prep and planting, hemp can be planted with existing equipment. In the picture on the far left there, I don't know how many of you have actually seen hemp seed before, but it's very similar in size to grain sorghum or milo. They're both in my hand there. The next picture to the right is a John Deere 71 Flex planter. This is about as basic of a planter as you can get. And using sorghum plates, it plants hemp just fine. The next planter over is a newer John Deere vacuum planter. And then the farthest picture over is a Great Plains grain drill, all planting hemp. So it's very possible. It's best to plant into a firm seed bed, and hemp is a generally shallowly planted crop. We recommend somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 inch deep. You wouldn't want to go beyond an inch chasing moisture. Hemp is a really tough plant. It is really resilient, but if there is a growth stage where you need to really take care to ensure a good stand, it's at emergence. It needs to be planted into uniform moisture, and it really doesn't tolerate crusting well. The hypocotyl is pretty weak, and you can't push through crust. So the emergence stage is really where you need to take care and get a stand out of the ground. But beyond planting, hemp is really just like any other row crop once it's growing. One important consideration now with hemp is weed control. There are no herbicides labeled for in-crop use, so if you do have a weed control problem, you can't go back and spray a rescue application. So you kind of have to do all the little things that add up to provide successful weed control. So those include starting clean. It's really important to have a clean seed bed at planting. You don't want there to be emerged weeds. One of the important principles in mechanical weed control is to have a size difference between the crop plant and the weeds that are competing with it. So you want the hemp to be as far ahead of those weeds as possible. So starting clean. And then in addition to starting clean, you really need to, for hemp's sake, to get it out of the ground, and also for weed control, you really need to try to plant into as optimal conditions as possible to get it up and out of the ground and growing as quickly as possible, because a lot of your weed control is going to be the competition from a healthy hemp crop. And then another important consideration is how you plant it. So if you plant it with a grain drill, you're really counting on the narrow row spacing to provide you with a faster canopy to where the hemp crop can shade out and outcompete weeds. And this is possible, but if it doesn't work for whatever reason, you're very limited on what mechanical options you have. If you plant on 30-inch rows with a planter, you have the option to cultivate, which is what we do in our seed production fields. This picture in the center here is the first cultivation, I think, of one of our fields with just a single sweep cultivator. And it's had finger weeders added to it, which actually poke into the row and knock out some of the weed seedlings that are in the row that are smaller than the hemp plants. This picture on the left here shows what hemp plants look like at emergence and how small and fragile they are. And then the picture on the right here is after the last cultivation, just prior to canopy closure, where we cultivate a lot more aggressively and really ridge it up, throwing dirt into the row and burying the last of the weed seedlings that are in the row to control that. Then a little bit about irrigation and fertility. Hemp has a pretty amazing taproot that can get down and access water relatively deep in the soil profile. And if there's one thing that it cannot tolerate, it's waterlogged soils, especially when it's young. The picture on the right here shows some hemp that's planted on poorly drained soils, exhibiting a lot of chlorosis and stunting. So it's not as much of a problem here, or rarely is a problem here in Colorado, but the further east you go, I know that becomes more of an issue. So site selection is important. Planting on well-drained soils is important. And then as far as irrigation goes, we've split pivots with corn before, and generally probably somewhere around 2/3 of the irrigation that was given to corn is what we actually gave to hemp. And then general fertility recommendations are about 80 pounds of nitrogen, 50 pounds of phosphorus and potassium. And those are just kind of rough general guidelines that have worked well for us in the past. It's something that may change with more agronomy trials that we plan to do in the future to really narrow that down and figure out exactly what fertility works best for Abound. So with that, gladly take any questions that anybody has. Thank you for listening.
Great.
Hi,
Thanks, Daniel.
My name is Rich
Oops,
Fletcher.
hold on. Not sure what happened there. We'll go back. Rich, I'll hold on you, and we'll go back to Daniel's question. Sarah, any questions that have been asked yet? I know Sarah's on mute, so she's going to have to take a second and come off mute. That's all right.
So Diane asked that she's seen recommendations for using sugar beet planting plates for this direct seeding process. Are sugar beet plates and milo plates equally as suitable for planting your seed?
Yes, I believe so. I don't have direct experience using sugar beet plates, but I don't see any reason why that shouldn't work.
We've used beet plates and they work just fine.
Great. Maybe to add to that question, some of the things that I hear from growers when I'm talking to them, are there other types of plates or other things either Daniel, you or Rich have seen or heard of that folks have used to plant hemp that seem to work well?
Anything, roughly that size, I'm not sure off the top of my head, I guess everything that you could possibly use, but any of those plates, or you can even get blank plates and drill your own holes to plant hemp. So it just has to be roughly that size. It should work fine.
Got
We've
it.
had guys actually make custom plates using the blank plate approach that Daniel just talked about.
Okay, excellent. Sarah, any other questions?
Yeah, how about 15-inch row spacing?
15-inch row spacing could be good. I think there's probably a trade-off between, your being able to have a higher population with narrow row spacings versus weed control and other things. So there's no reason why I wouldn't want to try a 15-inch row spacing.
Okay. Another one, is high density planting more optimal for CBD cultivars, or was that more focused on fiber cultivars?
So high density has definitely been used in the past for fiber cultivars, and what we're breeding for and promoting today is high CBD, I guess dual purpose varieties that can be grown at high density. Primarily, to fit into a row crop system and manage weeds through the canopy rather than trying to, at 2,000 to 5,000 plants per acre, there's a lot of bare ground out there. So it ends up being hand weeding and lots of passes with the cultivator. So high density can work for CBD as well as grain and fiber.
Okay. Desired planting dates. Do we have desired planting dates? I think, and desired soil temps for emergence. Do we have those?
Daniel?
Yeah, generally, I think probably depends on where you are and things like that around here. This past year we planted, towards mid to late May, but I think that could be changed some. And usually I think around 50 degrees or so is the soil temperature you want to look for.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and we're working on genotypes that you could plant earlier, as early as early March. In some test plots I have seen hemp emerge in a late February planting, and it was out by within 2 to 3 weeks. So emergence under cold soil and generally cold weather is a possibility. And the advantage there is you get way ahead of the weeds. Most of the annual weeds we deal with are warm weather and require pretty warm soil temps to get out. So that would provide a nice jump.
yeah, several of our customers this year have mentioned that they might like to try planting earlier. So this year, mainly due to regulations within states and the time it took to get licenses in some states where it was the first year growing, planting was later, maybe mid-June, which seemed to prove to be a little bit too late in some cases. So there are growers who've talked about even going earlier than, Rich, what you mentioned, or Daniel, late May, and starting in early May, maybe even as early as late April, and that'd be Kansas, Illinois, Indiana. So any thoughts on that? Is that too early, do you feel like, or would that work?
Yeah, I think it seems worth trying. The earliest we planted is mid-May, and it did work. And so if you're in a geography with a little milder spring, I don't see any reason why you couldn't.
Great. Sarah, other questions?
We were just going back to the Milo and sugar bake plates. Is there a preference that we have, or do we just say either one would work equally well?
I have a reason to say specifically one or the other. I just have more hands-on experience with the Milo plates, but sugar beet plates can work fine also.
Okay.
One of the nice things about our approach to hemp production with our Abound family of varieties is, the goal is to be able to have growers be able to utilize what you have on farm already, what type of equipment that you have already. And so working with you to figure out how you adapt. So whichever plates you already have, both seem to work well. As Daniel said, it doesn't seem like one is necessarily better than another.
Mm-hmm. Another one, what's the downside of weeds in the harvested crop?
Daniel?
Well, I guess several reasons. If you have a lot of weeds, they're competing for light and nutrients and water with the hemp crop, so that can reduce your yields. And then also, if you have a lot of pigweed biomass or something in with your hemp biomass, it reduces the quality of your biomass.
Okay. Have you seen buyer preferences for Abound cultivars rather than normal cloned production of a CBD crop?
Yeah, it depends on what type of farmer you are, and what resources you have available. Abound is for farmers that are growing row crops today and have the equipment to seed at high density and manage the crop as they would corn or soybean. If you're a tobacco grower or grow a crop where you're doing transplants more regularly, your operation's probably more suited to the clonal approach. So I think it's not a one size fits all, and it depends on what's the strengths of your farm are.
Okay. Another one, I'm in Florida. Will this type grow here okay? We get a lot of rain, and I saw no wet feet on a slide you had. That's for Daniel, I guess.
You have a answer for that one, Rich, as far as
So it's too early to say. We have not selected for latitudes in latitudes as far south as Florida. So we did send Abound to Florida as well as other southern geographies to test that out, but we are waiting for those data.
Yeah, and unfortunately in Florida, the one trial that we did have was wiped out with a hurricane. So we do know that it doesn't work well in hurricanes. Hopefully
Hurricane resistant.
It's not hurricane resistant yet. But to Rich's point, we have tested Rich though in different geographies like South Carolina, right, where they do get a little bit more rain. So any thoughts on how, we don't know if it stays wet all the time, but how it does there?
Yeah, the 2 seasons we had down there, we planted one in 2019. We planted in early May and had a good crop. And then it was really wet May into June. They planted late June this year. And again, no reason to think it wouldn't have worked. These are test plots. So we haven't tried anything commercially, but there's a reason to believe.
Yeah, and those are breeding plots. So the assumption going in is that that Abound is not going to be the Abound bred for Colorado 2730 is not going to be the best performing variety in every single place on Earth. So we're breeding new locally adapted varieties for the southeastern U.S.
Right. Thanks, John. And we'll, at the end of the webinar, I'll share a slide. We've got a couple of new varieties that we're launching in the Abound family this year. So we'll talk about that. Any other questions, Sarah? Maybe take one more and then we probably should move on and we can add those to the end.
Okay. We've got, what has been your experience with rate of pollination and seed versus CBD production for Abound?
Difficult to answer. We haven't really tried growing Abound without seed production. So the trade-off between seed and CBD is difficult to answer. I think the easiest way to go about that is Abound was bred as a dioecious variety. We've always selected for CBD content with the presence of seed. And the challenge there is the seed has no CBD. So as John mentioned, there's a challenge. We need to remove that seed to maintain the CBD potency of the flower. So I think that's probably actually a nice lead into my harvest management considerations.
Perfect. Well, we'll move into Rich's talk and then we will take more questions after Rich, then Dell will go and a few more questions there, and then we can open it up for any that we haven't hit on at that point. So let me move into Rich's presentation.
Hi, my name is Rich Fletcher and I'm the Director of Breeding at New West Genetics. And today I'm going to be talking to you about harvest considerations for Abound, where we're looking to collect both the grain as well as high CBD flower. Now, because harvest of the grain is pretty straightforward, most of my focus today will be on how best to preserve the quality of the flower, particularly the CBD content. And I just want to mention that the issues I'll be bringing up are not unique to Abound. So these are issues that feminized seed and clonal growers are also dealing with. So they are fairly universal. Now, before I talk about harvest and getting product out of the field, I want to bring up two main considerations that need to be considered during all aspects of harvest. The first is drying, where we need to get the flower from its field moisture content of 70% down to 15% or lower as quickly as possible. If we were to harvest a flower and let it sit wet in a pile at 70%, it would start rotting and become unmarketable within hours. The second major consideration is trichome preservation. Trichomes are the little hairs you see here on the flower and are the primary site of cannabinoid biosynthesis. And because they are small, they're fragile and easily lost during harvest. So a general rule is that the less we handle the flower, the better, since each handling operation really presents a new opportunity to lose them and the CBD content. Now I'm going to talk about harvest and actually getting the crop out of the field. Like most crops, we have two options available. We can swath and let the crop dry in the field, or we can direct cut and harvest the crop standing while it's wet. Of course, the geography that you live in is going to determine which of these options you have available. Farms in high humidity environments will obviously have a hard time with the field drying approach. So I'm going to start with field drying options, since these are what we're most familiar with in our company located in a dry climate like Colorado. A hemp crop can be windrowed with most swathers, and we found that draper head swathers tend to work the best. The windrow is going to dry for as few as 3 days, and really your harvest time is going to be determined by the moisture content of the flower, where we're aiming to harvest at about 15% moisture, and that's the state that we found actually maximizes threshability and minimizes trichome loss, since they'll still be hydrated at that level. Windrows can be harvested really with most any modern combine. Of course, it'll need a pickup head, and the combine would be set with modifications to lower the fan speeds and set sieves so that ultimately we're harvesting a seed and flower bulk. This seed flower bulk would then need to be transported to a processing facility where the seed and flower would need to be separated using an aspirator or some other similar piece of equipment. Now, we need to do this separation process for 2 reasons. One, of course, we want the seed, and we want to sell the seed since it does have marketable value. And 2, the seed actually does not contain any CBD. So keeping it in that flower actually lowers the CBD potency of the flower and lowers the extraction efficiency and really lowers its overall value. During this seed separation process, it is best practice to set up bag houses or some other type of dust collection system to capture any trichomes that may become airborne during the processing, since it's quite likely that the flower is going to be drier than it was at harvest, and those trichomes will be more susceptible to loss. Now I'm going to talk about direct harvest, and most of the concepts I've discussed already are going to apply, except of course that the crop's going to be harvested while it's standing and is therefore going to need some mechanical drying. So again, the crop can be harvested using most any modern combine, except this time we're going to need a different header. We found that row crop headers do work just fine, and the crop will be cut just below the base of the cola or the head of the crop. And this is where all of the flower and grain lie. Combine settings would again be adjusted so that we're harvesting seed flower bulk, which, as I mentioned, this time would be wet and would need to be dried immediately before we would move on to the separation process I described. Apart from row crop headers, we have found that stripper headers, which were developed for cereal crops, are also gaining popularity since they're designed, as the name would imply, to strip the seed and the flower off of the stem. And this minimizes the amount of fiber entering the combine. And this is a good point. Minimizing fiber during harvest is really a good rule, since even non-fiber hemp types do have very strong fibers, which will find wrap points inside a combine and can create a lot of headaches. And now the last form of harvest I'm going to discuss is a new innovation called the Interceptor from a company called FarmMax. So this is a form of direct harvest, and they've developed a bolt-on attachment which goes inside the combine and effectively separates the seed and the flower in the field during harvest. And it really has a couple of major advantages. One, it does the separation in the field, which allows these 2 separate products to go their separate routes straight out of the field. And secondly, it does the separation while the flower is still wet, And this serves to minimize trichome and CBD loss and ultimately preserve flower quality. So Pharmax is in their first year of marketing the Interceptor here in 2020, and we're really excited to hear more about their results. So just to conclude, make sure to select a harvest method that's appropriate for your geography. Keep a close eye on moisture content while you're harvesting, especially if you're harvesting windrows using the field drying approach. And finally, minimize the amount of flower handling you do as much as possible. Thanks for your time.
Great. Thank you, Rich. Appreciate that. Sarah, any questions for Rich?
When does Abound initiate flowering?
It has averaged about 54 days here in Colorado. The plantings in South Carolina accelerated that flowering time by about a week. So the answer is it depends on where you're growing it, but it is not photoperiod sensitive. It seems to be reacting more to heat units, or at least that's part of the flowering time pathway equation.
And we've got another one. What is the market for biomass at 5 to 8% CBD?
Marketing people.
I will take that one. I'll refer that to the marketing department. Wait, okay, here we are. Yeah, so it's an interesting question because we've been talking to growers, a lot of growers over the last 7 or 8 months, and some people will tell you that there is no market unless you have 10% CBD in your flower. And so when the market is really low and there's very low demand, which we had that situation happen to us in 2019, there was an overproduction after 2018 and in early 2019 when the prices were extremely high. You had a huge production. And so all of a sudden there was way more supply than demand. And also extractors the technology was evolving. So people were able to say, hey, we won't buy your flower unless it's at least 10%. Well, that's a problem because no matter what type of production, feminized or dioecious, the plants that you're growing are likely going to be averaging 8.5 to 9 at the very highest, or they're going to be hot for THC and illegal crops. So then if you have to cherry pick your top buds, which have your highest quantity of CBD in them, then you as a grower have to not use the rest of your plant. And therefore you take a big hit on, what do you do with the rest of that biomass? So that's a long answer, but I will tell you that as we've talked to extractors, they absolutely will take 6 to 8% CBD or flower biomass that's tested 6 to 8% CBD, and they are very able to handle that. When you grow Abound and you grow it across a lot of acres, you're getting more biomass as well as the CBD combined, and that's what you get paid on, your percent of CBD times your pounds of biomass. And so absolutely, extractors will take that. We're still at a very low point in the market, but we see that going up for a lot of factors that have happened in the marketplace this year. Weather patterns that have happened, fires out west, we've had hurricanes in the southeast, et cetera. So anything that you want to add, Rich, but I think that kind of covers extraction of lower, 6 to 8% CBD.
Yeah, you just want to factor in that cost of production if you're
Good point.
managing weeds with mechanical cultivators versus hand crews. That gets expensive really quick. So
yeah, absolutely. As Rich mentioned, when you plant the feminized plants and there's quite a bit of space between them, that gives a great opportunity for weeds to grow. And so if you don't want Daniel mentioned the competition for the nutrients with the weeds, then you have to go through and you have to hand rogue those weeds or pull those weeds. You also have to send in crews to hand rogue the males because one male can pollinate a lot of females. And so if you're trying to go for feminized only and you don't want that pollination, then you have to get those males out. That's a very expensive cost of production method.
So then we get another question. So you are reintroducing the contents of bagged capture of the fines, trichomes and other into the final harvested crop.
yeah, that is an option. It's something I think we would recommend, particularly if you're separating seed from flower under dry conditions, it's you will capture what looks like dust, but that is high CBD dust. And this isn't our core business, but from the processors we've talked to, it seems to be well worth the investment, depending on how your processing system works, of course.
Right. And in the Midwest or the Southeast, where the environment is more, it has greater moisture, if you're not harvesting very, very late, where the plant is really dry, that tends not to be as much of an issue. I'm not going to say it isn't any issue, but it tends not to be as much because your harvest moisture is higher. Therefore, the trichomes stay with the flower quite a bit more.
Okay, what is your average CBD percent when harvested with a combine?
So we see in our research trials, it's 6 to 6.5%, but the reason an entire section of this webinar was devoted to harvest considerations is that can be lost quickly if it's done incorrectly. And just to be perfectly honest, I think harvest technology and innovation is still in the early days. I don't think we can claim that we've optimized it yet. So improvements are coming, but yeah, the average is a tough answer. It depends on how well you did with those considerations.
Yeah, absolutely. And handling the flower, as Rich mentioned, during harvest and during your processing, as well as timing of harvest, makes a big, big difference. We have had folks who've harvested a little bit early, and that CBD content will continue to go up to a certain point as you leave that plant in the ground longer and make sure that it's fully mature before you harvest.
Okay, and how much THC does Abound typically show, ever above the limit?
We have not seen it above the limit, and in fact, it is an AOSCA certified variety, which in Colorado requires the crop itself, the seed production crop itself, be inspected by an inspector for uniformity and reproducibility. But then the other half of certification is we actually have to give seed to the Department of Ag. They grow it and they test THC independently. And so we have received those results, and it is THC compliant.
With field drying, do you get much seed shattering?
It certainly can be a problem if you let those windrows sit too long. That's why I highlighted keeping an eye on moisture content and harvesting when the field is when the crop is a bit wetter, just to minimize that. But if you let them sit too long, it gets very dry, the birds start eating it, and you'll leave a lot of yield in the field.
Sarah, maybe one more question, and then we'll move into Dell's presentation, and then we can come back at the end and pick up anything else that we've missed.
Okay, sure. And how much time or heat is needed from emergence to harvest? And then can you double crop with winter crops?
So from emergence to harvest, we've seen here in Colorado 110 days from planting to harvest on average. And as far as double cropping, that's sort of the beyond weed control, the early spring. So planting in March would, one of the goals there would be able to then double crop and replant a winter wheat crop. So I do think that is possible and would serve a couple of different purposes.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to double crop the same crop because of, that's the opposite of rotation and best practices. But if you could switch to another crop as you take it out.
Good point. And then the other piece, and Rich, you could comment on this possibly, but as with our customers, we have a lot of experience in Colorado. We're in 9 different university trials around the country this year, and we've been in university trials in the past couple of years to get better data as well. You may find that it's a little bit longer season than the 100 to 110 days that Rich mentioned. It could be sometimes maybe 110 to 120, and we're learning more each season. All right, let's move on. We're going to go to Dell's presentation, which is also pre-recorded. And so Dell will talk about sampling techniques and testing. And then once that is complete, then we'll have some questions. If you have any questions for Dell specific around sampling, we'll cover those. And then we'll come back to any questions that we've missed. All right, hang on, let me get this advanced. Should start, we hope. Hang on, let me move this to see if I'm missing the, I think I gotta click it. Hold on, there we go, sorry.
Hi, my name is Del Kreiser, and I'm the marketing manager for Botanacor Laboratories. Today, I'm going to discuss hemp testing and the proper techniques for submitting samples to your laboratory. This is a question we get asked a lot, and I know New West Genetics get asked that question a lot as well. So let's jump right into it. So today's topics, we're going to cover third-party testing, pre-harvest compliance testing, sampling and drying techniques, so the samples that you submit to your laboratory are going to be optimal, and choosing the right laboratory. Okay, QR codes. So throughout this presentation, you're going to see some QR codes, and if you have a smartphone, you can hold it up to the screen and it will provide a link to where there's more information on the topic on that slide. A little bit about Botanacor Laboratories. So we started in 2014 and we test everything in the hemp supply chain. So that's everything from biomass to work in progress hemp extract and all the way to finished consumer goods. And we also have a second laboratory called Agronomist Laboratories, which is a marijuana testing facility that operates in Colorado. So what is the goal of a third-party laboratory? You know, whether the lab is a pharmaceutical lab or a cannabis or hemp laboratory, their goal is to produce accurate, precise, repeatable, and legally defensible data. And the way that a lab will accomplish that is having tight process controls. And you do that by minimizing the amount of variability at every stage of your testing process. And it's not just the methodology, it's everything that goes into the laboratory. So the physical location itself, the instrumentation, all your SOPs, and of course the methodology. And the way that a lab will accomplish that is by following CGMP, so current good manufacturing practices and good laboratory practices. Having documentation for all your SOPs is important. If an auditor comes in and it isn't documented, in the eyes of the auditor, it hasn't happened. Independent verification and audits, so that will be ISO 17025 accreditation and participating in proficiency testing. So why is accurate testing important? By a laboratory controlling their process variabilities, you can look at your process variabilities and not the laboratories. So you can make educated business decisions off of those results. You're gonna, if you make products, you're gonna ensure consistent user experience. Maybe it's controlling production costs and avoiding recalls. So what is the goal of your testing? Is it compliance, where you're testing for potency, whether it's total THC or delta 9 THC? It may also be for a business transaction where you're using the potency scores to negotiate a fair price for the buyer and seller. You may also do contaminant testing to make sure your product is safe and ultimately making it more marketable. You may use testing for R&D, where you're trying to select the phenotype that has the best attributes. Just like New West Genetics, you know, they're using it for a breeding program. Or you may make a finished product where you have a dosage and you want to provide truth in labeling to your consumers. And product safety, again, testing for contaminants to make sure there's no contaminants in it and making it more marketable. So with compliance testing, we're going to focus on pre-harvest testing. And with that, you want to test early and test often. I can't stress that enough. You want to make sure that you have the data so you know when is the optimal time to harvest. A cautionary tale, we recently had a farmer reach out to us who didn't do any testing throughout his flowering cycle. and he didn't think the plants were mature. The state came out and tested, and unfortunately it was over 0.3% THC, was at 0.6%. And he had to watch his plants get burned down. And that's a situation you don't want to be put in. So you want to make sure that you test early and test often. So when should you test? You should test throughout the flowering cycle. So how long is your flowering cycle? Is it 8 weeks? Is it 9 weeks? Do you have an auto flowering strain? And if you don't know exactly how long your cycle is, you can reach out to the seed vendor, or if you bought clones, they should provide you with that information so you'll know exactly when you should start testing. Previous experience growing your cultivar. As you grow this cultivar over the seasons, you're going to have a better idea of when you should dial in your testing. And so how often should you test? It should be once a week through the flowering cycle. And as you get closer to the end of the flowering cycle and the THC percentages go up, you want to double that to twice a week. So I have an example here of a cultivar that has an 8-week flowering cycle, and you start testing on week 1 and so forth. You can see as it starts to go up, and this will give you a better idea of when you need to harvest. A lot of states will require that you submit a harvest plan. Here in Colorado, it's 30 days before. So you can see in this example, this person would want to submit their harvest plan in either week 5 or week 6. And this will give you some data on when that time is going to be optimal. When you submit samples to your laboratory, the goal is to mirror your state's sampling plan. And that way you're going to be sampling the same way that the state inspectors are, and that should give you an apples to apples comparison. So you want to review your state's sampling plan and follow that. And if your state doesn't have a sampling plan, you could look at the USDA sampling plan. You want to create a composite sample. You want to make sure that you're getting a good representation from throughout your plot and not just taking a sample off of one plant and submitting that. That's not going to be representative. So what you want to do is get multiple samplings from throughout that plot, and you will create a composite sample from that. How many samples should you take? So the USDA has some guidance. So if it's less than 1 acre, you want to select a minimum of 1 plant and take a sampling from that. And between 2 and 10 acres, you'll select a minimum of 1 plant, take a sampling from each one of those plants to create a composite sample. And then when it goes over 10 acres, it gets a little bit more complex, where you have the food code sampling plan. And this is what's being proposed by the interim final rule. So you can see when it gets up to 100 acres, it gets very complex. So this is all under consideration. So it's not in effect yet, but you can see that you can have, the sampling size can get quite large. When you do your sampling, there's different sampling plans, patterns that you can employ. It can be very simple, where you just take a sample from each quadrant, or you could get a little bit more granular and take multiple samplings. But a lot of states will recommend doing a sawtooth pattern, where you start at one corner of the field and work your way up, cut across diagonally, and then go up the other side, thus creating a sawtooth pattern. When you collect your samples, you want to collect from the top third of the plant and cut just the flower right under the bud. And that is what you're going to want to submit to the laboratory. So you don't want to submit any stem material, no fan leaf, just the bud itself. Remove any seeds or stem and submit that. Prior to submitting the sample to the laboratory, you want to dry it. The water weight of wet hemp can be anywhere from 70 to 80% water weight. And that water weight will affect the test. So you want to dry it ahead of time. Again, review your state's plan for drying. And it's usually around 60 degrees Celsius, which is around 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can put it in an oven at that temperature. You want to monitor it so it doesn't get too dry, but it's going to be dry to the, it's going to crumble to the touch or break off the stem easily. So that sample set that you took from your field, you want to make sure that it's homogeneous. You want to grind it and make sure it's even in consistency. And you can accomplish that by using a food processor. A lot of laboratories will use a magic bullet. I know the CDA here in Colorado, they use magic bullets in their SOP. And here's some examples of some hemp that we received recently. So this first sample wasn't ground, and this won't be homogeneous and not representative of the sample set. In this next example, they ground it, and it's very homogeneous. So no matter where the analyst samples from, it's going to be representative. So you want to keep that in mind when you submit samples to your laboratory. Choosing a laboratory, there's going to be some different considerations. What is the quality of the laboratory? You can speak to other farmers and get their experience with their labs. You also want to make sure that they have the proper certifications, and I'll get into that on the next slide with ISO accreditation and proficiency testing. Is the lab scalable? And do they have enough instruments to handle the volume of samples coming in, not only in harvest season, but throughout the year? If they only have one instrument, they may not be able to handle the volume. Do they have redundancies in place? These instruments can go down for maintenance, so can they switch over to another instrument, or can they turn on multiple instruments to handle the volume? What is the lab's turn time? Is it 1 week? Is it 2 weeks? Can they do next day or same day turns? And scalability and redundancies will factor into their turn time. And where is the lab located? They may be located in another state, or they might be local. The interim final rule, they have a 15-day window that is proposed, and that's not give a farmer a lot of time to get the tests done and back and have their harvest completed in 15 days. So that may come into play. And of course, cost. What is the cost of the laboratory? And you want to look at all these together and weigh each one and find the ones that are important to your business. And that will help you with choosing a laboratory. Third-party verification is really important. So has the lab participated in ISO 17025 accreditation? And there's two common accreditors. That's going to be A2LA and Perry Johnson Laboratory Accreditation. And you have proficiency testing. And with a PT lab, they will send a homogeneous sample to laboratories to test and plot them against other laboratories. And depending on where they sit, they may be too high or too low or clustered with other laboratories. So Emerald Scientific and Finova are two common PT labs. So you want to ask your lab for that. Have they tested, participated in proficiency testing? And you could also take it a step further and hire an independent auditor to audit the laboratory, or you may be able to audit the lab yourself. So ask the lab if they're open to being audited. So key takeaways, I want to stress that you want to test early and test often, and you want to do that while in the flowering cycle. Read your state's regulations and also read the USDA regulations. You want to understand everything that the state and the government expects of you, not just in regards to sampling and testing, but the entire process. And testing is integral to the success of your business. You want to make sure that you include testing into your budget. You budget for seeds, clones, water, electricity, nutrients. So you want to add testing into your business plan, into your budget. Okay, that ends my presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Here's my contact info below, or you can scan the QR code and that will put my contact info directly into your address book. Thanks so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this, and there'll be a Q&A session, and I'll be happy to answer some questions then. Okay, thank you so much, and we'll talk to you soon.
Great. Thanks, Del. Any questions, Sarah, for Del?
There haven't been any questions come through for Del. We've got some more around Abound.
Okay, before we go to those, Del, when you were at the Harvest Showcase in September, I know you had a number of conversations with growers. What types of questions did you get that you might want to share with the group and elaborate on a little bit?
Pretty much everything I covered in the presentation. A lot of it was around preparing their samples. So yeah, just reiterating, you want to make sure to get a representation of your entire crop and not just pulling a sample off of one plant. That's what a lot of people do. And also properly preparing the samples according to your state's specifications, and then sending that to your laboratory. And that will give you the best representation of that sample set.
And two key things that you mentioned that as I've talked to some of our customers and they've mentioned when they're doing their own sampling, one is not to just take your buds from the top of your plants, but you've mentioned several times a representative sample of the plant as well as of the field. I think that's really, really key. So you're not getting an artificially high test. Now, if you're testing for what your state is going to test for compliance, that may be what you want. But when you're thinking about for marketing your product to understand what you truly have as far as CBD content, you may not want to do that. And then the other issue I've seen some folks run into is they didn't separate the seed from the flower. And so therefore their CBD content was quite a bit lower. And once they came back and did separate the seed from the flower, their CBD content jumped, almost doubled because of that seed.
Yeah, depending on what you're submitting your samples for. If it's for a compliance test, you want to mirror the state's regs. But if it's for a business transaction, you want to prepare your product based on how you're going to sell it. So if it's smokable hemp, you want to test the flower.
Right.
You're selling the entire biomass. The buyer is going to want to see what the overall percentages are. And that's going to include the flower, seed, stem, everything. All ground up.
So it really does depend on when you're testing, what's the purpose of your test? If it's to make sure that you're compliant when you're going to harvest, you want to make sure you're following your state's guidelines. If it's to make sure that you understand what the marketable value of your crop is, you need to make sure you're following, if you're trying to market your biomass, your flower biomass, that you do have that separated out, et cetera, and you're getting a good representative sample so you know what that crop is worth.
Correct.
Excellent. Great. Okay.
I have one that just come through, sorry. What about, I guess, sampling for pesticide testing?
I'm not a chemist, but I would assume if the pesticides are applied throughout the whole harvest, it probably wouldn't matter where you sample from. But again, it would be best to get a representative sample from throughout the crop.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Any other questions specifically for Del, Sarah?
No.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you, Del. That was super informative. I've got a couple of slides to touch on, and then we'll go to open Q&A to pick up anything that we've missed. So I wanted to share with you, we've talked a lot about Abound, and the variety that we've been talking about that we grew last year on a limited launch was NWG 2730. And you can see here, we grew Abound various varieties this year on our fields in Colorado. We are launching 2 new high-performing varieties in the Abound family. So in 2021, not only will we be selling 2730, but we'll also be selling small quantities in a limited launch of NWG 4000 and NWG 2463. And you can see based on, this is limited yield results from our trials, but it is some yield results that we can share. What we got for seed yield for 2730 as compared to 4000 and 2463, and then also for flower and for fiber. So one of the things that you'll notice, well, one is I missed a comment there on my fiber for 4000, but what you'll notice is that the fiber yield goes down a little bit for 4000 and 2463. And that's notable from the perspective of, depends on what you're buying the variety for. If you want a tri-crop and you're truly interested in that fiber, as well as the seed for grain and the flower, then you're going to want to, look at something that has a little bit higher fiber content. If you're more interested in particularly the flower and the seed for grain, then you're going to, potentially want to look at something that has a little bit lower fiber. And we're going to be doing tests, again, of these varieties around the country. So this is limited data, and we want to make sure that we call that out, but they look really, really good. So we will have a limited launch in 2021 and some availability of those 2 new varieties in the Abound family. They both are showing higher CBD content than what we have in 2730. So high 6s into 7, sometimes in the low 7s, and we'll see more as we grow that more broadly throughout 2021. We'll have a much better idea and more data results to be able to share with you. Also stronger agronomic traits. So as we think about those agronomic traits we've selected for, like germination and stand, etc. So the agronomic traits we're trying to go for less bushy. So, more of the grain type of agronomic traits that we're looking for. So you'll be able to see that. And then we also have Colorado Department of Ag has certified both of these varieties as THC compliant. And we are in the final step for AOSCA certification. So our elite varieties, which are our grain specific varieties, are already AOSCA certified. And we are well down the path and very close to having final AOSCA certification for our ABOUND varieties as well, which is a key factor in many states. Anything to add, John or Rich, on these results?
No.
Those are pounds per acre.
Oh, thanks. I don't know why I don't have that on there. Good point. That is pounds per acre. I got one more slide, then we'll open it up again for questions. So you can see the pricing. I wanted to make sure that we shared pricing for 2021. We just finalized the prices for the 2021 season. So NWG 2730 will be priced at $1,900 per acre. These are per acre prices. 4,000, NWG 4,000, and NWG 2463 will be $2,500 an acre. Similar to what you see in your row crop purchasing with corn and soybeans, we are offering an early cash discount for anyone that wants to make a purchase prior to December 31st. You don't have to take shipment of the seed at that point in time, but we will book your sale and book the seed and make sure it's held for you. If you would like to do that by December 31st, then you can take 20% off that sales price that you see there per acre. Many companies price per seed or per plant. We do not do that. We price per acre because we want to make sure that you get the population that you need to plant on that acre to be successful. And so you're not limited with New West Genetics on a number of seeds per acre. It's just a per acre price. And we can discuss that in more detail offline. The other thing that we're doing is we've done a number of trials on our own fields as well as with universities. I think I mentioned earlier, we have over 9 university trials in the US plus some Canadian trials. And those US trials and Canadian trials have multiple locations. So we're getting all that data back now. What we'd like to do is do actual commercial field trials so we get data from farms like yours and so that you can understand what to expect. So we're starting a program, kicking it off for the season. We're calling it the 4x4 field trial program. What does that mean? We're asking you to plant 4 acres. You plant 4, we'll pay half, you pay half of those 4 acres, planting at least 3 varieties on those 4 acres, and then asking you to test and track following a protocol that we've put together at New West Genetics, and we'll share that with you. And then finally, to make sure that you can be successful, we find it to be most successful if you work with your local experts. So if you can work with your agronomist and or your university extension person or people that you like to rely on, we think that you'll be the most successful. So let me know if you're interested in this. You can inquire on our website, and you can also let me know directly. We'll share contact information here shortly, and we'll see what we can set you up with for 2021. Given that, then Sarah, let's move on to any other questions that we have for the whole group.
Okay. Yeah, we've got a few more come through here. What is ABOUND's grain yield like in comparison to other commercial grain varieties such as Catani, X59, CFX2? And has ABOUND been tested for end-use grain quality or flavour reception?
Rich, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. So comparison to those specific varieties, we have not included them as checks in our internal trials here. I don't know how many of the trials that Jenny's been talking about they're in. So I have not had, I don't think much of that data is in yet. So head-to-head comparison may be coming. But ABOUND has been tested for end-use grain quality and flavor. for fatty acid profiles, amino acid profiles, and then of course flavor is a sensory panel, so fairly variable and specific to whoever the processor is. But we have sent that to processors.
Also, maybe I might mention in the 4x4 trial that we've just talked about, if there's a variety that you have planted that you do want to do a head-to-head comparison in, we would welcome that as we're trying to collect more and more data with ABOUND data specifically for the various varieties in the family, but also competitive varieties. So we would definitely welcome that. Other questions, Sarah?
North Plains or Canadian hemp grain growers often harvest after a hard freeze to facilitate dry down. Will this impact CBD concentration?
The freeze per se will not lower CBD concentration, but to the point of the dry down facilitation, as those trichomes dry, they become more brittle, and so that's why I mentioned a specific flower moisture content. So, you know, as that dries, the loss to the atmosphere could increase.
Yeah, I think to follow up on that, basically that you don't have a lot of, if you do the hard freeze approach, you don't have a lot of flexibility. The cells of the plant are going to die and lose moisture rapidly after that, and so if it's snowing or whatever else comes with that hard frost and you can't get in there right away, that takes away your ability to manage the moisture, like Rich was emphasizing needs to be done.
Other questions, Sarah?
Yeah, price per acre, what population do you get?
So on the prices that I shared, what we recommend is that you plant 30-inch rows. And I think Daniel mentioned this earlier. It just makes it easier for you to be able to cultivate for those weeds prior to canopy. And so it just makes it a lot easier to handle all of it mechanically. That's the price per acre that we're basing it on, is on a 30-inch row. If you're looking at drilling 7.5-inch or some other method that you want to consider, we would be open to the conversation.
Okay, and we've got a couple of ones about growing. Do we have any seeds available for the Virginia region? Is there any?
So I'll take a shot at that then, Rich, if you want to add in. Yeah, I would say that the seed that we have to sell, all 3 varieties that I just shared, the 2 newest varieties are in pretty limited availability for 2021. We will be ramping up our ability to produce that and have greater supplies available in 2022. However, I'd say we're learning a lot, as Rich already mentioned, what type of data we have. We've been in trials in multiple states, so we know that we've had good results, but we don't have specific trial for the Virginia area. As far as data goes, we would expect that you'd have good results, but we don't have any specific data on Virginia. Rich, anything to add?
No, mine was going to be a very breedery answer, that we haven't selected specifically in Virginia, but I think given its latitude and some of what we've seen in other nearby states, it should work. It's really more about how are you going to run your production or your row cropping. I think there's a good chance it'll fit.
And a final one, can we ship seeds to Canada, and do we have a Canadian seed rep?
We actually have a marketing agreement with a company, T3H, in Canada. And so you will be able to purchase seeds, assuming they get final approval, which I believe they're expecting November, December timeframe. We just had a conversation with them yesterday. So as soon as they have that final Canadian approval, which we think it's imminent, then yes, you'd be able to purchase from them. We can share their contact information with you if you send us a note or let us know, and we'll make sure that you get connected to the right folks.
I think they're in 54 latitude in Canada. Is that?
Rich?
What's that?
I assume that's about fit on where they're located in Canada.
Yeah, 54 latitude in Canada.
Well, we haven't we are entered into the Canadian Hemp Trade Alliance trials. So this will be our first broad sampling of adaptation to Western Canada.
And we don't have those final results back yet, but we expect those pretty soon. We've been in communication and we expect those within the next couple of weeks.
Yep.
Great. Well, we are just about at time. So thank you, Sarah, for reading off all the questions that we got. And thank you, everybody who's participated, for joining us. We really appreciate it and hope that the information that we've shared has been beneficial. We will be posting a webinar recording, so we'll send a follow-up email to everyone with that webinar recording information, as well as with our contact information if you have further questions on the varieties that we have available for sale, or you want to take advantage of the trialing program and or the early cash discount. So you can also send questions or get information at the link below, information@newwestgenetics.com. We appreciate everybody joining, and thanks to the panelists for sharing the information. And we will have another webinar, and I don't think our date's on here, coming up in December. Let me see if I just didn't go to the last slide, Sarah. So the next time will be, our virtual series will continue on December 8th with Follow the Seed. And we'll be focusing on how to select the right seed to ensure success in 2021. Our expectation is by that webinar, we'll have more data from some of the university trials that we've mentioned. And so we'll be introducing the specific agenda here in the next few weeks, but put that on your calendar and we'll be back together again. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day.
Thanks, Aram.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.